in Africa and market drivers. Took the hunting out because I think a lot of these pegmatites are a bit more developed than pure exploration plays in nowadays, and we're getting quite far down the development pipeline. So just a disclosure, you can read it at your leisure. And so why lithium? What is lithium? Discovered in the 1800s, and its initial uses in the 1940s were some of the first hydrogen bombs. Its applications today are largely now still energy related, but on the greener side of things. Its main applications are ceramics and glass, greases, catalysts in the polymer production, fluxes, air treatment, pharmaceuticals, and I suppose the two most relevant here, although I won't really touch on the aluminium aspect, but aluminium with green energy and EVs is a big input into the EVs, and lithium decreases the density, increases the strength, and obviously then lithium ion batteries. If we just look at how the market's changed over the last 15 years, we've gone from 125,000 tons lithium carbonate equivalent through to last year 437,000 tons lithium carbonate equivalent. And you can see that the lithium ion segment of that market's tripled. Incidentally, last year saw a decrease from 2019, just as a result of COVID and a bit of a surplus that entered the market. So if we look at the demand, it's been growing at about 10% a year. It's set to accelerate to 20 to 25% a year, and largely taken up by battery demand. And this is the same slide, really, just a bit more granularity. And in terms of the battery demand, it's largely EV driven, electric vehicle driven, which is the green bars. The blue bars are from energy storage and electronics. And this on the right is really just taken from a Bushveld Minerals presentation. And obviously it's a competing technology with a whole lot of other technologies. And it's more horses for courses in terms of energy storage. But for electric vehicles, your lithium ion battery at the moment is your what's a charge of choice. If we look at what's forecast for the lithium market, as you can see, 2019 there's a bit of a surplus, and they forecast a surplus again for this year, and then going into a deficit going forward. This is work done by Benchmark Minerals. So why lithium ion? Well, it's a known proven technology. The prices have been coming down, and you've got various chemistries for various applications in the electronics and electric vehicle space. And you can see here, just bang for your buck, I suppose, lithium ion has a high specific power and energy density. Obviously, there are a few cons that everyone knows about: vehicles catching fire, the batteries tend to degrade over time, and they have a limited temperature operating range, so they do require some sort of heating and that in colder countries. So why this demand? Well, it's the rise of the EV and energy storage, obviously as a result of efforts made to curb CO2, increasing CO2 and pollution levels. Many countries have also have put policies in place to mitigate CO2 emissions, and a lot of that has revolved more recently, and it's been quite well publicized, on electric internal combustion engine restrictions, and largely in Europe, North America, but countries like China, although they haven't necessarily formalized that, they have got policies in place to look at reducing their carbon footprint through the transport sector and public transport. And if we look at global CO2 emissions, transport probably makes up about 16% between 16 and 25%, depending on your source of your CO2 emissions. And obviously that varies from country to country. As you can see, South Africa, no surprise, electricity generation, when they're generating it, is 42% of our CO2 emissions. A country like Norway, only 3% from electricity generation. But you can see why transport and generation sector have been targeted to try and curb CO2 emissions. If we just look at an internal combustion engine versus an EV, this is just a sort of a generic example, but you can see it, you can sort of drop it to about 40 grams per kilometer on a battery electric vehicle, depending on the energy mix. Obviously, if you go to a zero emissions energy charging, you drop it down to 1 gram a ton. 1 gram CO2 per kilometer, but obviously that's probably quite a long way off for many countries. COVID last year, well, it obviously had a big impact on the transport sector, and it provided us a bit of a glimpse into what is possible by curbing CO2 emissions from vehicles. And there was about 2 gigatons reduction in CO2 emissions compared to 2019, of which 1 gigaton of that carbon dioxide came from the transport sector. And if you look at the makeup of that 1 gigaton, 265 million tons was from the aviation sector. But it translates into, I think, 100 million conventional cars being taken off the road. Obviously, by the end of the year, with lockdowns coming to an end, CO2 levels got back to normal very quickly and on the increase. So I suppose the question, where to from here? Well, with a sustainable recovery, we can probably look at dropping CO2 emissions. Without a sustainable recovery, we'd look at on the trajectory of increased CO2. But I think what COVID's allowed a lot of countries to do is to sort of expedite their policies around electric vehicles and changing the energy mix to more renewable sources. And this one just shows the rise in EV sales over the last couple of years, and it's been quite meteoric. China's always been sort of the big market there. However, recent years, we've seen the rest of the world catching up quite quickly. So if we look at where South Africa sits with this, companies like, I think it's BMW and Jaguar have put quite a lot of charging infrastructure along some of the major routes to Cape Town, Durban, and the Windy City. If we look at EV sales in South Africa, they've been pretty dismal, and it's really just, this is just looking at pure electric vehicles. We're not looking at hybrids here. So the two companies really that dominated at the moment are Jaguar and BMW. Nissan used to sell the Leaf. I don't think they sell the current generation, but I think there are plans to bring it back. If we just look at total sales up to December 2019, this is looking at hybrids. So obviously your Toyota Prius has led the way, along with a couple of other hybrid vehicles offered by various other manufacturers. If you look at plug-in hybrids, you've got the likes of BMW, Volvo with their offerings, and then just pure battery electrics. The sales up to December 2019 were only 545. So South Africa makes a very small segment of that market, largely because EVs, I suppose, are seen as a luxury item at this point. The study by Green Cape basically looked at what South Africa has in terms of a EV infrastructure and building a supply chain around that. Our vehicle component and production in South Africa accounted for about 30% of the country's manufacturing output in 2018, and more than 14% of South Africa's total exports. So there's definitely a need for South Africa's auto industry to get with the program, I suppose, and actually modernize. because otherwise we're going to be found left out in the cold very quickly if we don't, I suppose, develop with the rest of the world in that sector. But we do have the makings of something that with potential to sort of start producing electric vehicles. I just thought this was quite an interesting picture of reserved for green vehicles, and probably a dirty diesel buggy, looks like an Isuzu parked there. I suppose the big thing that's happened now as well is greenwashing, where people sort of paint a picture that they are environmentally friendly, but don't really walk the talk. That's changing quite rapidly, and companies need to change their supply chains, regionalize them to reduce the carbon and CO2 impact. Supply chains need to be sustainable. Your products need to be sustainable. You need to look at end-of-life impacts of your products. And obviously, this all goes hand in hand with the ability to raise funds and just actually participate in this low-carbon economy. Yeah, and I suppose it's no use producing lithium-ion batteries in electric vehicles if your supply chain's dirty. And really that just goes around sort of performance, your ability to make money, and sustainability, and just that whole supply chain. And that's a whole talk on its own. So if we look at what's happening in the battery space, in 2015, there were only about three or four companies looking at producing these bigger factories where they produce these lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles and electronics and that. Come back to 2020, you've got 186 planned plants. I see Volkswagen yesterday announced they were looking at building, I think, 6 factories and basically going the Tesla way. And you've gone from 57 gigawatt hours to 103.1 terawatt hours. So it's quite a big shift. So if we look at what it's done, this whole hype has done to the lithium price. Lithium's priced according to lithium carbonate or lithium hydroxide. And you'll also see reference to SC6, which is spodumene concentrate, 6% lithium oxide. And they also track each other, but basically what you had leading up to 2016 was a bit of a panic buying and a boom in the price, largely because your supply was so constrained. The first to respond to the supply were your hard rock lithium producers, which are your pegmatite miners, just because they're generally smaller and less capital intensive to develop. Your big brine deposits in South America are a lot more expensive, and usually it takes about, I think it's about 12 to 18 months to get material just through your process. So when they expand, there's quite a large lag time between getting the evaporation ponds out and actually being able to produce a product. Obviously then, around 2018, you had a lot of mines entering the market and a bit of an oversupply, and your chemical converters that produce the lithium carbonate from the spodumene couldn't actually keep up with the supply. So it ended up with a bit of a glut in the market and prices dropped. And obviously that sort of had quite a big impact on some of the junior miners that fell by the wayside, and even some of the producers, junior explorers and producers. And then COVID hit, didn't help things. So if we look at where we are now, prices are on the uptick in China at least. And I suppose you look at share prices on the juniors, and even some of the producers in Australia are sort of up 100% plus over the last 6 months. And I suppose prices do need to stabilize at a point where it is sustainable for mines to actually start producing material. So if we just look at what the lithium-ion battery comprises, just to simply break it up, you've got an anode that's usually made of graphite. You've got a cathode that's got varying formulae, but it contains lithium, and then you've got an electrolyte, which is your charge carrier, and your lithium's your charge carrier, and then a membrane separator between the two. Obviously, lithium forms a small component of these lithium-ion batteries, depending on the chemistry. But like Robert Friedland likes to say, they should be called nickel batteries, although lithium's your key component in these things. But nickel's a large component of these. And then you've got cobalt, manganese, or you've got the lithium iron phosphate batteries. Obviously, some batteries charge quicker than others. Others have better energy density. So really, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. And obviously, that's going to have an impact on a couple of other markets as well. The components that go into these batteries is very chemical specific. So it's not just any nickel that you can be putting into these batteries. It is quite a refined product. Similarly for cobalt and things like your manganese. And all of these markets are forecasting a bit of a deficit leading up to 20, sort of in the next 5 to 10 years. If we look at what lithium-ion battery prices have been doing, they've generally been dropping, and quite dramatically. I mean, $300, obviously these prices vary a bit, but this is just sort of the general trend. $300 a kilowatt hour, 2014, today we're sitting at around $100. And obviously you're getting sort of efficiencies in your manufacturing and that, but it is going to reach a point where it plateaus based on your commodity prices. And that volatility is something that a lot of these producers see as a risk. And we've seen a lot of OEMs and your chemical producers actually trying to take interest or stakes in mines to ensure that they've got a supply. And obviously there's a lot of geopolitical risk associated with this as well for countries to meet their CO2 agendas. If we just look at where the resources sit globally, a lot of them sit in South America and Australia. But if you look where the production's coming from, 5 years ago, most of it would have been coming from South America. Today, most of it's coming from Australia. And it's due to sort of shift back to about a 50-50 split between Chile and South America and Australia in the next couple of years. Obviously, there are other countries that have significant lithium resources. Incidentally, Zimbabwe is the 5th largest producer of lithium globally, all out of Bakita. And it's mainly petalite for some of the technical, for non-battery applications. So if you just look at what I was saying here, Australia is the largest supply at the moment, but that's bound to change as the rest of the world comes online. And you're going to probably start seeing production coming out of Africa, Europe, and America who do produce, but they don't disclose what they're producing. But the likes of Piedmont Lithium are supplying or due to supply Tesla in the near future. And again, that's just on a trend of increasing demand. And hard rock is going to probably be the biggest winner out of this. If we just look at the supply chains where the flows of materials go, it's largely mined in Australia and Chile. Your refining all happens in China, a bit in Chile. And then your chemical production, again, China, Japan, South Korea. Your cell productions, again, China and South Korea, Japan. And your battery assembly, Japan, South Korea. So obviously, this comes with a huge geopolitical risk. And what you are seeing now is all these gigafactories going up, and they're not going up necessarily in the Chinas and South Koreas, but in Europe and America. So I think companies have seen the need to firstly sort of de-risk it geopolitically and also just shorten supply chains. And obviously they cost it to reduce costs. in addition to the carbon dioxide impacts. This is a bit of a big slide to take in, but the takeaway from this is your ores refers to your pegmatite derived minerals, and your spodumene and your brines are from the South American brines. And they produce very different chemicals. So lithium carbonate's generally your input into the batteries. Historically, that was the case with your spodumene as well. But with the chemistries of some of these batteries preferring lithium hydroxide as an input, your spodumene materials or precursors can go directly to hydroxide and then into your batteries. And there's quite a big cost saving there. And it was always a case of your brines being sort of a cheaper, lower cost compared to a pegmatite derived material. With this circumventing the carbonate step, you actually bring costs pretty much in line. There's parity between the two. So there's not much benefit going one or the other. And obviously your pegmatites are a lot easier to mine, quicker to market as well. And just in terms of the companies that dominate this market, 75% of your lithium supply comes from 5 companies, namely Albemarle, SQM, Ganfeng, and Tianqi and Livent. So they generally dominate the market, and I think it is sort of a topic of another discussion as to sort of how they control prices. So let's get to the geology. And I've been talking about brines and pegmatites. Well, lithium deposits, you've got actually 4, I suppose, potential sources of lithium. You've got your traditional brines, your lithium pegmatites, usually spodumene and petalite are your minerals that are mined in these. And then you've also got your sedimentary deposits like your jadar deposit and your lithium clays that you're seeing a lot of juniors exploring for. You've got Rhyolite Ridge and Sonora in Mexico. And then you've seen companies like, I think it's Vulcan in Germany, looking at the geothermal waters, recovering lithium from there in your oil field brines. To date, none of these have actually produced any lithium. And your pegmatites tend to have quite a wide grade range, but they're generally quite high grade in terms of lithium oxide and relatively small, where your brines are massive low grade deposits. You just look at the global distribution. Your brines sit in South America. You've got some, I think, in North America. Your pegmatites are generally distributed quite all over the world. And then you've got some of these unconventional deposits like Clayton Valley, which is your clay deposits. You've got Jadar and a couple of other deposits in this Vardar zone that stretches from Turkey. And that's also a massive boron producer. And if you just look at where the global resources sit, largely in your salars, your brines, your hard rock deposits, and then you've got this sort of mix of various other deposits. If you had looked at this a couple of years ago, it was really just dominated by your pegmatites and your brines, and not much consideration for other lithium sources had been given. So if we look at, I'm going to sort of focus on the pegmatites because Africa, we don't have the brines. There have been a few salt pans that have been tested, but really with no success. So that's just Frank Hesse's take on pegmatites. And I suppose the reason why I got involved in pegmatites was really just an excuse to go and pick up gemstones when we were doing some work in Mozambique in 2000. So what is a pegmatite? Well, this is a definition by London: extremely coarse grain, systematically variable grain size. That grains vary in size by a factor of 100 from the margins to the center. You've got skeletal or graphic crystal textures, unidirectional growth habits, prominent spatial zonation in mineral assemblages and textures, or any one of the above, but usually you get a combination. And this picture here on the right is just a picture of a pegmatite. So if we look at pegmatite classification, your pegmatites are subdivided into two broad families, NYF, which is niobium, yttrium, fluorine family, or lithium, cesium, tantalum family. And that's really just based on the mineral chemistries that you find in these pegmatites. The ones that are the focus of the lithium industry are your complex type pegmatites and your Spodumene pegmatites. Generally, these complex types are quite well zoned. You tend to find they're a little bit smaller than some of these Spodumene pegmatites. And the Spodumene pegmatites generally tend to be quite big, massive deposits with sort of grade, quite a variability in grades, but quite generally on the high side. And high side, I mean usually sort of north of 1.2, 1.3% Li2O. Whereas, and usually the mineralization is distributed quite evenly through the pegmatite, whereas these complex pegmatites have quite well-defined monomineralic zones. If we look at a PT diagram as to the formation of where these pegmatites form, you're looking at this area here where you see petalite spodumene, and I'll come back to the significance of this sort of phase diagram between petalites and spodumene as well, because that has quite important implications when it comes to looking at pegmatites and mining them. And it's just quickly pegmatite 101. Everyone sort of probably knows the general model. You've got a S-type granite, fertile granite, that as it crystallizes evolves off sort of incompatible elements that migrate, form pegmatites away from the main granite body. And generally your last pegmatites to form are your lithium-bearing pegmatites. And again, this just picture here looks at your complex pegmatites, generally quite well zoned. Not always concentrically zoned. As you see here, they may be asymmetrically zoned and sometimes very poorly zoned, where you've really got sort of quite coarse-grained material with some aplitic zones in between. The main lithium minerals that you find in these pegmatites are spodumene, petalite, eucryptite, amblygonite, lepidolite, lithiophyllite, and zinwaldite. I suppose the most important two are spodumene, which is generally the one that everyone's looking for at the moment for inputs into your battery sort of, supply chain. It's got the highest, well, not the highest, but one of the higher lithium grades. Your petalite often has more technical applications, so in the glass and ceramics industry. And spodumene is also used in the glass and ceramics as well, but I think most supply now is destined for batteries. Then you've got lepidolite, which has a lot of nasties in it, like fluorine, which when it comes to processing can be quite corrosive on the plants. And obviously your chemistry to clean that up and get a decent lithium carbonate would be quite difficult. But there are technologies around that can produce or can process things like amblygonite, lepidolite, and lithiophyllates and all that. This is what some of these minerals look like. They can be quite gemmy, in which case you get kunzite, or quite well bladed crystals here in a matrix of K-feldspar. Your petalite, quite grey. This is altered petalite from Rubicon, or quite sort of sparry and looks quite a lot like feldspar. Incidentally, this sample here, the little white lines that you see is actually spodumene within the crystal, and I'll show you a thin section of that shortly. This is what your lepidolite looks like, usually quite purple. You get some quite pretty textures within the pegmatites, and it can vary all the way through to sort of a grayish color. And then you get some other funnies where your lithium reacts with your host rocks and you get lithium amphiboles. And this is sort of just, it'll give you a kick when you're looking at core. You'll get a bit of a lithium kick, but it's not something that would be of any significance in terms of mining. And then obviously you've got a couple of other minerals that can contain a bit of lithium. In terms of why the PT conditions under which these form is important. Your petalite generally forms at higher temperatures, and as these pegmatites cool, they tend to exsolve spodumene. Whereas if you've got a pegmatite crystallizing within this sort of spodumene area, you'll get primary spodumene forming. So obviously you do get pegmatites where you've got a mix of these two, and it makes processing quite difficult because your spodumene is quite a dense mineral, and the processing is quite different from petalite, which has quite a low density of about 2.4 tons per cubic meter. Spodumene is 3.2. And yeah, these are just some notes as to what how your melt chemistry impacts what crystallizes out. I'm not going to delve too deeply into that right now. These are just some photomicrographs from Highbury pegmatite by Thomas et al., where you've had petalite crystallize and exsolve spodumene, and this is quartz here. So if you assay that sample, you'd get probably a lithium oxide grade of about 4.5%, which is petalite. Individual crystals of spodumene would be 8%. And obviously this sort of material would need to be milled quite fine to actually get your spodumene liberated. Similarly for petalite, this is that same sample again, a thin section of it. You can see there's quite a bit of spodumene in here, in amongst the petalite. And again, that's going to be a bit of a processing challenge. And yeah, you'd end up with two product streams potentially with this. So, and then you've got very fine grained SQUI as spodumene quartz intergrowth. So this is very fine grained. And there's probably a bit of eucryptite in there as well, just to make things interesting. In petalite as well, you get this incipient weathering. And again, what you'd have here is that when you start crushing a material or blasting it, your petalite's probably going to fall apart and produce quite a bit of fines. So it really just does talk to the need to understand your mineralogy, and it's on a sort of a microscopic scale as well. And this sort of early stage test work is quite important in any project. So if we come to Africa, Africa is quite well endowed with pegmatites. Currently we produce about 70% of the global tantalite, 9% of global tin, with less than 2% of lithium supply. The significance of the tantalite and tin is that lithium forms in the same deposits as these tantalite and tin deposits. So obviously the lithium remains quite an untapped resource. If we look at exploration, we've had quite a bit of work in West Africa, work in Namibia, you've got Zimbabwe, and then I suppose the big one in the DRC, where you've got Manono, which is, I think, the largest lithium resource reported to a code compliant standard globally. It's 400 million tons, 1.65% Li2O. And then you've got places like South Africa and Angola, which have pegmatites and potentially have lithium-bearing pegmatites, but haven't really been explored to any significance. If we look over time, if we look at the African context, these brown circles, we've got these, I suppose, geological terrains that host pegmatites well within these periods where pegmatites were generated. And so again, it really just speaks to the potential that we know Africa has. If we look at South Africa, I suppose the three areas that you'd look at, you've got the Namaqualand belt, where there has been some exploration and a history of mining pegmatites in the past. You've got the Karpal Craton, where you've got these greenstones, and often you do find these lithium-bearing pegmatites in greenstone belts in Australia. All the gold mining jurisdictions, pegmatites were quite a pest when they were exploring. They just found pegmatites in the core, and it was really something that was sort of logged and never looked at again. With this recent boom, all that old core has been hauled out, and they've been looking at that core from the gold mining exploration. So you've got the likes of Barberton, and you've got some of the greenstone belts up here that do have records of spodumene-bearing pegmatites. And then there's this Highbury pegmatite down in the south coast. If we look at the Namaqualand province, you do have quite a lot of lithium-bearing pegmatites out in the west and a bit of a trend in the east. And this is really from Woolard. And there's quite a variation in the lithium-bearing pegmatites from quite homogeneous, unzoned to quite well-zoned pegmatites. The one that I looked at a couple of years ago was this Blesberg pegmatite that had been mined in the past for its beryl. It has quite spectacular spodumene crystals. They were found to be quite altered and not really carrying much lithium, and the exploration was stopped quite early on. But the work they did manage to find extensions to the west of the pegmatite, and it just shows that a lot of what we know about these pegmatites isn't what, so what you see is not what you get. There's a lot more to them, usually extensions to these pegmatites. You just look on the Carpal Craton, you've got this Green Hills pegmatite out in the Vredefort that does look, I know someone was exploring or looking to explore, I'm not sure where that got to, but it does look like quite a nice pegmatite, quite big spodumene crystals. You've got spodumene occurrences out near Swaziland border, and then a couple out here. But again, a lot of these were exploited for, I think, beryl and tantalite in the past. But really just like a side note that they contain spodumene. And then obviously just going back a couple to Highbury, I think there was some work done quite recently where they looked at where there was some drilling, but I don't think the results were too great, and I think exploration there has stopped. Then you've got the Damara Orogen in Namibia, it's a Pan-African belt, and you've had exploration here at Rubicon and Helicon by Desert Lion, now Lepidico, and they were looking at mining the Lepidolite from that pegmatite. I'm not sure where that project is at the moment, but I think not much is happening there. You've got the Uis belt. I see some of the African guys are here, and at Uis they're targeting the tin mainly, but there is a lithium resource that has been published along with their tin resource quite recently. And obviously there are a lot of other pegmatites within this belt that potentially could be mined for lithium, but haven't really been explored in too much detail. So, yeah, all these tin pegmatites would potentially contain lithium as well. If we look at Rubicon, quite a well-zoned pegmatite. The resource was 8.8 million tons at 0.5% lithium oxide at a 0.2% cutoff, and the mineralization was largely lepidolite, petalite, and some alteration materials in the form of cookiite. Its surface expression was quite prominent and quite an easy thing to find. And a lot of these pegmatites with quartz cores do stand proud and are often quite easy to find. If we look at the Uis Tin Project up in the Northern Tin Belt, these are pictures from Afritin's website and from MSc Ashworth in 2014. While these pegmatites can be well exposed, they can be blind. So again, it goes to this need to explore these belts in quite a bit of detail, and not just, if there's one pegmatite, there's usually more. And understanding the structural regime of these areas is also quite important, because they often come in as in echelon structures. And you can see some of the mapping that was done by Afritin. You've got these pegmatite veins along a sort of quite a well-defined trend. In the south, some of the older pegmatites in Namibia, you've got Tantalite Valley, and that's around a mafic body on the edge of it in the Strange Shadow. You've got the Homestead Tantalite mine down here. And there are a couple of other pegmatites around there as well that they're looking at. But on the back of it, you can see if you zoom in, you've got all these pegmatites here, and it's quite an unexplored area, but I'd suspect that there is a fair amount of lithium mineralization associated with those as well. Madagascan pegmatites, Madagascar is generally quite well known for its gemstones, but there is some lithium potential. Generally, these pegmatites are quite odd in terms of mineralogy, and sort of exploration to date by one or two juniors hasn't really yielded anything too newsworthy. We look at Namibia, Zimbabwe, fifth largest lithium producer in the world. You've got Prospect Resources, who are probably one of the earlier guys to the market with their resource at Arcadia, and one of the biggest resources globally, 72 million tons at just over 1%. Their mineralogy is quite complex in that it contains petalite and spodumene, and they would end up generating 2 product streams. And obviously that has quite a big impact on the type of plant they need to put in. And yeah, and it's a series of stacked sills varying between 4 and 10 meters thick. We look at what these pegmatites look like. You've got this banded aplite that to the untrained eye could just pass as a lice. And then you've got your sort of more homogeneous pegmatite, coarse-grained petalite, spodumene bearing. And that's hosted in these Archean volcanics basalts. And then just, it's quite a simple zonation. You can see the grades sort of vary generally from 1 to 2% through the pegmatite, with a bit of a higher grade core. And like I said, it's a series of stacked sill-like bodies. And this is just what some of their core looks like. You've got these aplite zones that generally developed in the footwall of the pegmatite, but you do find them sort of randomly through the rest of the pegmatite body as well. And then your sort of coarser grained petalite, spodumene mineralization within the main pegmatite body. So what you learn or see in the textbooks and what you see in the field, they can be 2 vastly different things. If we look at Manono, that's a Cabaran age pegmatite. And like all things, I think someone had a sense of humor by putting it in the DRC, because DRC is a challenging country to work in, and they do have some of the largest copper, cobalt, and now lithium deposits in the world. You've got about 13 kilometers of strike in a series of pegmatite bodies. Exploration to date is only focused on this bottom sector, and this pegmatite was mined for tin historically. And basically mining stopped when they got to the fresh rock interface. So yeah, the exploration focused down in the southwest. Resource drilled is 400 million tons, 1.65% Li2O. And obviously there are some tin credits that go with this, about 800 ppm tin. If we just look at the thicknesses, you've got 260 meters in some intersections at 1.74% Li2O. So essentially the approach for mining this would be a bit like an iron ore mine, because it's just so big. Pegmatites that you would sort of normally I suppose a junior company would explore of 10 to 20 meters thick, sort of look quite insignificant when you're looking at the size of this thing. And these again are some of the textures. You've got these aplite zones, quite coarse-grained zones of spodumene and feldspar and quartz. And this pegmatite would be this spodumene albite type pegmatite. The spodumene, like I said, is quite coarse-grained. Quite big blades of spodumene here. In the core, you can see quite long laths. You do get finer-grained portions. So it does look like you may have initially have had some petalite starting to form, and then your sort of quartz exolved out and spodumene crystallized. But most of your spodumene is primary. Then you've got the Alto Ligonha pegmatite belt, which hasn't really been the focus of much exploration recently. Pan-African belt, also mainly known for its gemstones, but you do have quite a few lithium-bearing pegmatites, and these, I think it's the greens are your blues are your lithium-bearing pegmatites within this belt, and it's a metasedimentary belt. Your lithium pegmatites tend to be preferentially hosted within the amphibolites, and if you just look at the error mag, you can see these purple stars are your lithium-bearing pegmatites. And they do tend to focus themselves around the magnetic highs, which are your amphibolites. And that's a trend that you see throughout Africa. Most of these pegmatites have some sort of mafic association in terms of host rocks. The significance of that, I'm not too sure, whether it's just a rheological thing or if there's anything more to it, I don't know. And Iron Ridge, just a bit of a West Africa, bring a bit of West Africa in. They've got quite a small resource at the moment, but again, you can see there are a lot of pegmatites around here. And I think more recently, some of their sterilization drilling for their plant, they discovered a whole swarm of pegmatites. So again, it's sort of a case of, if there's an account of one or lithium-bearing pegmatite, there are often others around. And it's just understanding that structural regime into which they intruded, being able to target these quite effectively, it helps. And then obviously the dumps, like I said, Manono was mined for its tin. Obviously it was all weathered material, but there was a bit of fresh rock, and this is a photo from some of those dumps. And there is potentially some spodumene to be recovered there. And this is what these dumps look like. They sort of form little mountains. Kamativi, I think I did some work there a couple of years ago on those dumps, and that resource was about 25 million tons at 0.6% Li2O, and it's largely spodumene hosted. And then obviously there are the dumps at Uis, which I think a company a couple of years ago declared a resource on, but haven't heard much since. So yeah, I think, as you can see, Africa does stack up quite well globally. Places like West Africa are quite well located to supply into Europe and to America. You've got the DRC, where you could potentially get material through to Tanzania. And Namibia also very well situated, good transport infrastructure, and getting things to port is quite easy. And I suppose it just begs the question, what about South Africa? And these are just some of the guys operating in South Africa in terms of exploration. AVZ are the guys at Manono, Afriton are Uis, Zimbabwe Lithium are the Kamativi dumps, Iron Ridge are West Africa, Codal and Firefinch are also West Africa, Prospect Resources, Zim, Premier are Zim, Force Commodities, DRC, Lepidolite, and Namibia. And then obviously there are quite a few smaller private guys exploring. So if you just look at how the resources stack up, you've got the grade, sort of a grade tonnage plot here. Size of the bubbles is the amount of contained lithium oxide. Roche Duras sits out here. I suppose the closest comparison is Greenbushes in Australia, which is originally a Tantalite mine, but also a big lithium producer there. And then all these pink bubbles are African pegmatites. Your grey blue are rest of the world. And these green bubbles are just your unconventional, your sedimentary hosted deposits, just as a comparison. And Jadar also is quite a massive deposit. So I think, you've got quite a range from quite small to massive. So I suppose just the challenges in the lithium industry at the moment is, you've got quite complex supply chains that are quite geographically constrained. Quite a bit of price volatility over the last couple of years. there's supply deficits forecast, and then it's just managing the ESG risks so that you can sort of attract the investment you need and just not irritate the people whose back doors you're mining on. The general trends, I suppose, in the industry and mining industry in general are slow carbon economic transition, which is driving, I suppose, this move to electric vehicles. Auto manufacturers securing supply chains and regionalizing them. There's potential change in the source of lithium. So I suppose if we start seeing these lithium plays coming online and the technologies to extract the lithium gets to a point where they can do it economically, those will be a major player. Obviously, your battery chemistries and that are also sort of have quite an impact as to what inputs go into them in terms of the likes of nickel and copper, nickel and cobalt, or whether it's lithium iron phosphate batteries. Your costs are dropping and your energy density increasing, and the lithium ion battery technology changes constantly. I mean, a few years ago, it took ages to charge a battery. Now you can charge these batteries pretty quickly. So you don't have to sit and sort of spend the night to charge the battery if you're traveling somewhere. And the range anxiety issue then sort of falls away. And then obviously just how public transport and how going green and how vehicles are used. And then I suppose it just comes with, you need that government support, I suppose, just to kickstart the industry. I suppose this lithium craze initially was based on anticipated demand. We're seeing that starting to be realized quite quickly. And there's like this growth is set to continue. Obviously, Africa is quite well endowed with pegmatites, well positioned globally. You've got a country like South Africa where a lot of the, I think, cobalt comes through to our ports, and it won't be a big step if you had a sort of battery plant that started processing, or chemical production plant that started producing some of these precursors in South Africa. So I suppose if you just look at some of the news, you have got this mega million company down in the Windy City, looking at producing batteries, well situated in terms of the auto industry in South Africa. South Africa produces a lot of the high purity manganese. So it comes to that earlier slide where we do have the infrastructure, we just need to develop it. And I think guys like NAMSA are starting to see the risk to South Africa's auto industry in terms of not keeping up with the rest of the world. At the moment, 3 out of every 4 cars manufactured here are destined for Europe. So if internal combustion engines do become a thing of the past, so will South Africa. And yeah, these are just some exploration notes. I'm not really going to dwell on those, but really that's my talk.